A sinister ledger beneath the floorboards. In the colonial records of 17th century Connecticut, historians came across something far more disturbing than just numbers or bureaucratic ledgers. Between the years 1647 and 1685, over 300 wills were filed in the small devout settlement of Newfield. What made these documents troubling wasn't their sheer volume, but the fact that they were all executed under the guidance of 3 men with the same last name, Peton. At first glance, it might have seemed like a coincidence, perhaps a respected family trusted with administrative duties. But what lay beneath the floorboards of their home painted a very different picture. Hidden under the wooden planks of the Peton family home were hundreds of small glass vials, most of them sealed, but many still containing traces of opium and belladonna, potent substances, known even at the time to induce hallucinations, confusion, and compliance. Alongside these vials were journals filled with meticulous entries that chronicled the so-called divine visions experienced by dying members of the community. According to these records, 23 people died within days of signing their wills, each experiencing what witnesses later described as rapturous communion with the divine. These weren't mere hallucinations or coincidental religious delusions. They were carefully engineered spiritual manipulations, and each time the Peton family's wealth grew quietly legally and under the cover of religious solemnity. For many years, these unsettling documents remained buried, sealed away by colonial authorities who feared that revealing them would undermine trust in the religious and governmental institutions that held their fragile society together. It was a time when people's entire understanding of life and death was intertwined with faith. To suggest that the most respected men in a God-fearing town had used spiritual deception to orchestrate inheritance fraud and murder would have been more than a scandal. It would have been a spiritual crisis. And so the records were hidden until centuries later, when one determined researcher unearthed them and began to ask the most dangerous question of all. What really happened in Newfield? Unearthing the Forgotten. The 1998 discovery. The true unraveling of the Peton legacy began not in a courtroom or pulpit, but in the archives of Yale University, centuries after their crimes had faded from memory. In 1998, a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a specialist in early American medical practices, stumbled upon a reference in a seemingly unrelated collection of papers. While researching the evolution of palliative care in colonial New England, she encountered an obscure note in the private correspondence of Jonathan Edwards, the famed theologian of the First Great Awakening. Edwards had written cryptically about false revelations brought forth by men cloaked in piety, citing a Peton case as an example of the dangers posed when spiritual authority becomes corrupted. Intrigued by the vague allusion, Hawthorne embarked on what would become a multi-year research endeavor. She traced the footnote to a misfiled archive box at the Connecticut Historical Society, and within it found handwritten copies of colonial legal proceedings, pages of medical recipes, and, most chillingly, a faded leather-bound journal belonging to a young woman named Constance Peton. Inside were observations, dates, and emotional pleas that painted a picture of a calculated and ongoing conspiracy, one that blurred the lines between medicine, religion, and law in terrifying ways. Hawthorne's work didn't just breathe life back into the forgotten horrors of Newfield, it revealed a larger truth about colonial society itself. In an age where death came quickly and faith was absolute, There existed a dangerous vulnerability. People placed unwavering trust in those who claimed to speak for God. That trust was exploited by the Peton brothers in ways more advanced and more sinister than many thought possible for their era. Through Dr. Hawthorne's research, the Peton case emerged as an early example of psychological manipulation and pharmacological abuse carried out under the guise of religious service. Her work helped historians understand not only the depth of the Petons' crimes, but also the conditions that allowed them to flourish for so long without challenge. A town ripe for infiltration, the vulnerability of Newfield. Nestled in the rocky hills and thick forests of colonial Connecticut, the town of Newfield was little more than a cluster of wooden homes arranged around a meeting house. Like many early American settlements, it had been founded by Puritans seeking religious purity. Dissenters from more established towns who believed others had grown too lax in their devotion. Life in Newfield was harsh. Winters were brutal, food was often scarce, and disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters shared by large families. By 1647, the town was still struggling to define its identity, both spiritually and structurally. It was in every sense vulnerable. Into this precarious world stepped three strangers arriving from the Massachusetts Bay Colony with papers of commendation, respectable clothing, and confident bearing. Their names, Obadiah Jeremiah and Cornelius Peton, would soon become synonymous with benevolence, wisdom, and pious leadership. To the people of Newfield, their arrival felt like divine intervention, a doctor, a preacher, and a lawyer sent not by coincidence, but by Providence itself. What no one suspected was that these men had targeted Newfield with precision. They had chosen it because it was isolated, sick, desperate, and easily impressed by men of education and formality. The town's structures, legal, religious, and medical, were rudimentary and loosely enforced. The Petons knew this. They had studied the gaps and cracks in early colonial society and found the perfect community to exploit. While other settlers sought to survive through toil and prayer, the Petons arrived with a plan. A plan that combined forgery, pharmacology, psychology, and performance. And it all began with their carefully forged letters bearing the names of prominent Boston ministers, names no one in Newfield would dare question. Their deception wasn't merely opportunistic. It was systematic. The Peton brothers, a physician, a preacher, and a lawyer. The three Peton brothers presented themselves as the ideal trinity of colonial leadership, a doctor to heal the body, a preacher to guide the soul, and a magistrate to govern affairs of law and land. Obadiah, the eldest, at 34, wore the mantle of a learned physician. He spoke modestly of his training in London and carried a black leather satchel of tools, a rarity in the colonies that earned him instant credibility. His demeanor was serious, his speech deliberate, and his presence reassuring to settlers who had little access to organized medicine. He quickly became a fixture in the homes of the sick, tending to the elderly and diagnosing illnesses with what seemed like divine insight. Jeremiah, aged 32, played the role of minister. He claimed to have studied at Cambridge before crossing the Atlantic in pursuit of spiritual purpose. Tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look through a man's soul, his sermons were entrancing, sometimes lasting hours, yet never losing their fire. He preached with a conviction that stirred both fear and faith, quoting scripture with precision and framing every misfortune as part of God's divine plan. His spiritual authority grew rapidly, and within a year he was seen not just as a preacher, but as a prophet of sorts, a man whose words could calm the dying and steer the living. The youngest, Cornelius, 29, was the most socially adept. Claiming expertise in colonial law and record-keeping, he was soon entrusted with all legal documentation in the settlement. While his brothers maintained a solemn air, Cornelius wore finely tailored clothes, carried himself with polished ease, and often smoothed over disputes with charm and clarity. He knew how to read people, how to bend a conversation toward consensus, and how to write documents that few would question. Within months, the brothers were ensconced in positions of power across Newfield's legal, spiritual, and medical institutions, a monopoly of trust and authority that no one yet realized was the foundation of a monstrous fraud. Power, piety, and the Petons' unmarried image. In a time when family and procreation were not just cultural expectations, but spiritual imperatives, the Peton brothers' lack of wives or children might have seemed curious, perhaps even suspect. Yet when questioned, they responded with an answer that silenced all doubt. "We are married to the Lord's work." Jeremiah would say, his eyes filled with somber conviction. In Puritan New England, where religious devotion eclipsed all worldly concerns, this response was not only accepted, but admired. Celibacy, while rare, could be seen as an even higher calling, especially when framed as a life wholly dedicated to serving God's flock. What the people of Newfield saw were 3 devoted men, each operating within a sacred sphere: medicine, ministry, and law. Together, they provided care for the sick, comfort for the dying, and legal protection for the vulnerable. Their home became a beacon of service, modest in outward appearance, but always open to those in need. It did not matter that no children laughed within its walls, or that no matron managed its hearth. To the townspeople, their house was a sanctuary, a place where the dying found peace, the poor found counsel, and the faithful found affirmation. This public image of unwavering piety and tireless service was not an accident. It was deliberately cultivated, a performance the Petons enacted with precision. They attended every funeral, every town hall, every Sunday service. They donated surplus grain, administered free medicine to the indigent, and often waived legal fees for widows. These acts of generosity, however small, wove a powerful illusion, the idea that these men were not interested in wealth, but only in righteousness. And this illusion would become their most powerful defense. What few understood was that the Petons' unmarried state also served a more practical purpose. Without spouses or heirs, they could move and act as a unified front, sharing secrets and schemes without the risk of exposure through pillow talk or domestic interference. Their household was an echo chamber of strategy where morality could be twisted and guilt suppressed. No one would overhear their whispered plans. No child would stumble upon a locked door. They were monks in robes of deception, cloaked not in humility, but in the armor of unaccountable power. The first sacrificial lamb. Sarah Holcomb's final testament. Sarah Holcomb was no ordinary parishioner. As the widow of one of Newfield's founding fathers, she had inherited a substantial estate, 60 cleared acres, a sturdy home, a barn, and livestock. With no children and no living siblings, she represented an ideal target, a wealthy, isolated woman whose death would cause minimal familial disruption. When she fell ill in the winter of 1647, Obadiah Peton diagnosed her with consumption of the lungs, a common death sentence in those days. But unlike others, she received more than just standard care. She received the Peton treatment. For weeks, the three brothers visited her daily. Obadiah administered tinctures and powders, promising relief. Jeremiah prayed by her side, reading scripture and invoking visions of heavenly peace. Cornelius handled her legal affairs, reviewing her will and offering suggestions for revisions in line with divine intent. To the outside world, their care was above reproach. But in the privacy of Sarah's sick room, very different ritual was unfolding. According to a journal later recovered from the Petons' home, Sarah became the first subject of what Obadiah labeled the elixir of divine sight, a murky brown liquid administered in gradually increasing doses, designed to induce religious hallucinations and suggestibility. Jeremiah's role was to introduce divine guidance regarding property, while Cornelius stood ready with legal papers, leaving blanks to be filled in by whatever visions Sarah claimed to receive. These weren't visions from heaven. They were the product of chemical manipulation and whispered suggestion crafted to benefit the brothers. The final entry for Sarah was chilling in its precision. Day 5:15 drops. Responds favorably to mention of a husband. Believes he awaits her in heaven with instructions. Jeremiah shows her the family Bible. Cornelius transcribes her utterances as final wishes. The result was a new will signed in a state of ecstasy, leaving her entire estate to the Peton brothers to be used for the benefit of God's servants in Newfield. When Sarah died days later, her funeral was a town-wide event led by Jeremiah, who spoke movingly of her spiritual insight and generosity. Cornelius read the will aloud to murmurs of awe and reverence. No one questioned it, the ministry of preparation and the cycle of death. With Sarah's death came the birth of something darker, a ministry masquerading as mercy. Word spread quickly about her peaceful passing, her visions of heaven, and her divinely inspired bequest. Families began to request the Peton services whenever a loved one fell gravely ill. And each time the pattern repeated like the chorus of a haunting hymn. Obadiah diagnosed, Jeremiah consoled, Cornelius documented. The elixir of divine sight became the secret sacrament administered to those deemed ready to meet God and eager to fulfill their final mission on earth. By the spring of 1650, the Petons had acquired 4 additional properties. Their reputation soared. They were now the wealthiest family in Newfield, yet they maintained modest appearances, simple clothing, sparse furniture, and constant talk of building a proper church and school. Their wealth became seen not as excess, but as a blessing, a sign that God favored their ministry. They hired laborers, expanded their home, and began exerting influence, not just as caretakers of the dying, but as leaders of the living. Their strategy was masterfully layered. Each phase of their manipulation reinforced the next. The medicine made the victims vulnerable. The spiritual language shaped their hallucinations. The legal paperwork turned ramblings into official declarations. And all of it was wrapped in the unquestionable cloak of faith. To question the Petons was to question the very concept of divine revelation, and in a society where God was the only certainty, few dared to tread that path. This growing ministry became a self-sustaining engine fueled by death, shielded by faith, and lubricated by legality. The community, blinded by trust and softened by grief, not only failed to stop it, they fed it. And the Petons, with every new funeral and every new inheritance, sharpened their methods. They were no longer just con artists. They were engineers of pious deception, rewriting the sacred relationship between life and death for their own gain. Piety as camouflage. The brothers calculated charity. What made the Peton scheme so insidious was not just its structure, but the precision of its public image. The brothers understood that the best lies are hidden in truth, and so they became the embodiment of virtue. They donated part of every harvest to the poor. They provided free consultations to those who could not pay. They funded repairs to the town's meeting house and even started a small charitable fund for orphan children. These acts, performed with solemn humility, became proof of their holiness in the eyes of the community. This carefully cultivated benevolence served a dual purpose. First, it disarmed suspicion. When Goodman William Fletcher, a town elder, expressed quiet concern about the growing list of property transfers to the Petons, he did so privately in whispers. When he brought his doubts to Jeremiah, the minister responded not with anger, but with compassionate sorrow. "Brother," he said, "such thoughts are the devil's whisper. Let us pray for your clarity." Fletcher, ashamed of his doubt, left the meeting feeling chastised, not by threat, but by righteous empathy. Second, these public gestures created a web of psychological obligation. To question the Petons was to question generosity itself, to risk alienating the very hands that fed the hungry and comforted the sick. No one wanted to be the first to raise an alarm. And as the brothers wove themselves deeper into the moral fabric of Newfield, they made suspicion not just socially costly, but spiritually dangerous. The message was clear: if you doubt the Petons, you doubt God's work. This camouflage was further reinforced by events like Testimony Sundays, where friends and neighbors of the recently deceased were invited to recount the spiritual visions witnessed in the Petons' presence. These testimonials, deeply emotional, often tearful, legitimized the experience, created peer pressure against dissent, and ensured that any challenge to the Petons would be seen as a personal attack on the faith of those who had just buried a loved one. In this way, the Petons became untouchable. They wrapped themselves in Scripture, clothed themselves in charity, and stood above reproach, not through fear, but through faith. Their greatest trick was convincing an entire town that their manipulation was a miracle. And the longer they played this role, the deeper their roots sank into the soul of Newfield. Unquestioned authority, the Petons' ascension to power. By 1655, the Peton brothers had successfully entrenched themselves as the undisputed authorities in Newfield. Their control was not merely symbolic, it was institutional. Jeremiah Peton was officially ordained as the town's minister, the spiritual cornerstone of a deeply religious community. Cornelius Peton was confirmed as the settlement's magistrate and sole legal record keeper, granting him exclusive access to all property transfers, wills, and contracts. Obadiah Peton, whose medical miracles had now entered the realm of legend, had the unwavering trust of every family facing illness or death. In essence, the Petons now held complete control over the body, the soul, and the law. This trifecta of power was carefully cultivated and brilliantly maintained. It was not achieved through coercion or force, but through performance, persuasion, and piety. Each brother knew his role and played it flawlessly. Their seamless coordination made them appear as instruments of divine will rather than individual men with motives. They didn't just act as caretakers of the town. They became the town's conscience, its healing hands, and its guiding voice. To question the Petons was no longer a matter of personal skepticism. It was tantamount to heresy. Their growing wealth, once noticeable, had become normalized. They lived in a larger, better-equipped home, owned more land than any other family, and had access to luxuries uncommon in frontier life. Yet they continued to present themselves as modest stewards, using their wealth for the Lord's work. This careful balance between apparent humility and absolute power created a shield that no one dared to pierce. They were above suspicion, not by hiding, but by becoming the embodiment of righteousness. And so their scheme continued, victim after victim, will after will, until their name was not only trusted, but revered. By combining the spiritual, medical, and legal spheres into one impenetrable stronghold, the Petons had built what few in any age could ever achieve: a system of exploitation so morally insulated that even their enemies bowed before it. But as with all great cons, the threat would come not from outside the system, but from within it. The unexpected variable, Constance Peton, arrives. In the summer of 1664, the carefully orchestrated world of the Peton brothers was quietly disrupted by the arrival of a young woman named Constance Peton. She introduced herself as the niece of the brothers, daughter of a fourth sibling who had remained in England but had recently passed away. She was just 16, slender and tall, with the same dark, intelligent eyes that gave Jeremiah his air of piercing discernment. But unlike her uncles, Constance carried herself with genuine warmth and openness that endeared her to the townspeople almost immediately. Her presence created an unexpected complication. The Petons, for all their cunning, had built their power structure as a closed unit. 3 men, no wives, no children, no liabilities. Constance changed that dynamic entirely. Now someone lived with them, someone young, observant, and not yet indoctrinated into their narrative. Initially, the brothers tried to position her as an asset. In letters later recovered from their private correspondence, Jeremiah noted that her presence would enhance our appearance of family respectability. Cornelius, more pragmatic, saw both opportunity and risk. "We must secure her loyalty, or silence her curiosity," he wrote bluntly. Obadiah, ever the watchful observer, worried most. "The girl asks too many questions. She sees too much." Yet for the first few months, Constance remained compliant. Grieving her father and grateful for a home, she wrote letters back to England describing her uncles as strict but kind and Newfield as a community of stern but decent folk. Her early impression was innocent, almost naive. But in a town where no one questioned the Petons, Constance's quiet curiosity would soon become the only spark of light in a growing darkness. A hidden chamber and a chilling discovery. Roughly 3 months after her arrival, Constance's innocence began to fracture. While cleaning Obadiah's study, she stumbled upon a false bottom drawer in his medicine chest. Inside were strange vials, labeled in a cipher she didn't understand. When she asked about them, Obadiah reacted with sharp reprimand, warning her never to touch those compounds, claiming they were dangerous experiments not meant for women's hands. Constance was rattled but unsure of what to believe. She might have dismissed the episode as nothing more than private eccentricity had it not been for what she witnessed shortly thereafter. Thomas Thatcher, a prosperous farmer in Newfield, fell gravely ill. As per local custom, the Petons were summoned, Constance, accompanying her uncles under the pretext of helping with the children, witnessed something deeply unsettling. From the cracked door of the sick room, she saw Obadiah administer a dark liquid unfamiliar from his standard medicines. Within an hour, Thomas began speaking in disjointed, delirious fragments, claiming to see angels and hear heavenly voices. Cornelius, sitting beside him with quill and paper, gently guided the dying man, and did the Lord reveal, who should tend to your fields? Did he name who should inherit your mill? What Constance saw in that moment, a sick man made suggestible spiritual imagery. Manipulated legal documents conjured in tandem with hallucinations was the first full glimpse of a vast, hidden operation. She began to connect the dots, the specific patients chosen for care, their social isolation, their wealth, the lack of heirs, Obadiah's chemical vials, Jeremiah's spiritual whispers, Cornelius's waiting pen. Each played their part in an unholy rite, cloaked in mercy, but soaked in manipulation. She could not yet prove it, but her instincts screamed a single truth. This was not salvation, it was sacrifice. A young woman in a cage of silence. Despite the horror that was beginning to unfold before her eyes, Constance remained silent. In Puritan New England, a young orphaned woman, even one with connections, held no real power. Her safety, her shelter, even her reputation depended on the very men she now suspected of monstrous deeds. To speak out without concrete evidence would not only put her at risk of being dismissed, it could result in her being punished, disbelieved, or institutionalized as melancholic or possessed. The colony had little patience for women who challenged male authority, especially within the realm of the church. So she chose a different path: caution, observation, strategy. Constance began her own quiet investigation hidden behind smiles and daily chores. She started a journal carefully noting dates, patient names, and property transfers. She offered to help Cornelius with paperwork, giving her access to legal records and wills. She assisted Obadiah in the apothecary, memorizing which bottles he reserved for specific patients. She listened attentively to Jeremiah's private conversations and sermons, absorbing every rhetorical trick he used to prime the dying for divine revelation. What Constance was constructing was not just a narrative, it was a case file piece by incriminating piece. She knew she would need more than suspicions to stop the brothers. She would need a map of their methods, evidence of intent, and above all, a plan for escape. Because with every passing day, the brothers grew more attentive to her, asking about her health, hinting at her maternal inheritance, and monitoring her movements. Constance knew the trap was closing, but she also knew she had one advantage her uncles had never accounted for. She was watching them now, and she was not afraid to record the truth. The secret room, beneath the firewood. It wasn't until the brutal winter of 1665, nearly 18 months after her arrival in Newfield, that Constance Peton uncovered the physical heart of the Peton brothers' deception. A severe snowstorm had descended upon the settlement, isolating homes and freezing the dirt paths that wound through the forest. During this blizzard, the brothers received an urgent call to minister to a dying elder, leaving Constance alone in the house for the first time. She had long suspected there was more to their operation than what she had seen, and now she had her opportunity. She began her search with deliberate care, moving through rooms with practiced silence. Her instincts guided her to the cellar, a cold, musty space beneath the house rarely mentioned by the brothers. Behind a wall of stacked firewood, she discovered a false wall cleverly constructed but imperfect in its concealment. Behind it lay a door, and beyond that, a hidden chamber, the true sanctuary of the Peton brothers' operations. What she found inside would haunt her until her final breath. Shelves lined the walls, each holding glass vials of varying colors and viscosities, many labeled, some coded, others containing only residue. Botanical specimens floated in alcohol-filled jars, while glass distillation tubes and copper burners sat atop stained tables. It was a fully equipped laboratory, far more advanced than any medical facility typical of 17th century colonial America. Among the clutter, she recognized tools and materials described in European medical texts, some of which, according to records later recovered, had been stolen from university collections in England. The implication was chilling. The Petons had been preparing for this scheme long before arriving in Newfield. Most disturbing of all was a locked cabinet which Constance managed to pry open using a fireplace poker. Inside were personal mementos, locks of hair, rings, buttons, and clothing scraps, each neatly labeled with a name and date. These were not trophies in the usual sense. According to Obadiah's notes, they were used for creating attuned elixirs concoctions designed to resonate with the subject's humors and spiritual predisposition. This revealed a level of psychological and biochemical planning well beyond simple poisonings. The brothers weren't just exploiting their victims, they were crafting experiences tailored to each soul. But what made Constance's blood run cold was a ledger written in Cornelius's distinctive hand. It listed properties, values, and acquisition dates, along with a separate entry, CP inheritance from maternal grandmother to be secured upon 18th year. Her initials, her fate. She had not stumbled into the conspiracy by accident, she was the next intended victim. A desperate plan for escape. Now armed with evidence, Constance faced an impossible decision. She could not expose the brothers publicly. Their grip on the community was too strong. To accuse them outright would result in scorn, exile, or worse, her swift removal by any means necessary. She needed to leave Newfield, and she needed to do so quietly. Over the next several weeks, she copied essential pages from journals, tucked away a small amount of money by selling embroidered linens, and packed a modest bundle of clothing and food. Her destination, Hartford, where colonial authorities might take her seriously. She planned her escape for April 15th, 1666, the day a merchant convoy was scheduled to pass through Newfield on its way to Hartford. She would meet them in the village square at dawn. The night before, she recorded her final entry in her secret journal. Uncle O prepared a special tea this evening, insisting it would help me sleep. I pretended to drink. If I do not reach Hartford, let whoever finds this journal know the Peton brothers have enriched themselves through wickedness. I fear I am next. The following morning, Constance was seen near the village center by several townsfolk. She appeared alert, calm, and clearly waiting for someone. Jeremiah Peton found her there, according to witnesses, and engaged her in what seemed like a serious but calm conversation. Then he gently led her back toward the Peton house. By midday, Obadiah was going door to door, reporting that Constance had wandered off in a fevered state and was now missing. Search parties were formed, but were carefully directed to areas far from the Peton property. Cornelius remained at home to coordinate the efforts. It was a masterful misdirection. The true search for Constance's fate had already ended. What happened in those intervening hours is still a subject of speculation, but one entry in Obadiah's recovered journal may offer a clue. Administered double dosage. No resistance. Duration shorter than expected. Jeremiah to arrange discovery by streambed. Prepare eulogy by Sunday. 3 days later, Constance's body was found in the woods nearly a mile from the house. Obadiah declared she had succumbed to the same melancholy that had once taken her father. At her funeral, Jeremiah spoke movingly of her gentle soul and troubled spirit, reinforcing the narrative of a young woman lost to internal demons rather than external evil. The journal that survived the fire. The Petons might have escaped exposure if not for a humble servant, goodwife Rebecca Wilson, who had helped with chores at the Peton home. While cleaning Constance's room after the funeral, she discovered a loose floorboard. Beneath it, carefully wrapped in cloth, lay the young woman's journal, filled with names, dates, and observations that could destroy the Peton Empire. Unable to read, Rebecca brought the journal to her husband, Thomas Wilson, one of the few literate men in the village. As he read the entries, his expression shifted from curiosity to horror. Though terrified of retaliation, Thomas chose to act not by confronting the Petons directly, but by sending a copy of the journal to colonial authorities in Hartford via a trusted trader. He knew that time was limited and that his life could be in danger. His caution proved wise. Just days later, Thomas Wilson fell mysteriously ill after sharing a meal at the Peton home. He began to experience delirium fever and terrifying visions just like the victims documented in the journal. Obadiah declared it a spiritual affliction. Jeremiah preached that Thomas's death was evidence of divine justice. But others, particularly his widow, began to whisper. His death came too soon after the journal's discovery, too suddenly to be ignored. Meanwhile, in Hartford, the journal arrived safely, sparking immediate concern. Investigators began collecting testimonies from relocated Newfield residents, comparing timelines, and uncovering a pattern of death and inheritance that perfectly matched Constance's claims. But despite the mounting evidence, they faced an uphill battle. The brothers were revered as saints, and Constance was still a young, unmarried woman. Her testimony, even in writing, would be dismissed by many as hysterical or unreliable. Officials moved slowly, cautiously wary of political and religious fallout. Still, they pressed forward. The night the house burned. By early 1667, the case had reached a critical mass. Colonial officials, now equipped with corroborated evidence, dispatched a delegation to Newfield with orders to arrest the Peton brothers and search their property. But when they arrived, they found a scene of chaos. The Peton home had burned to the ground the night before, reportedly killing all 3 brothers in their sleep. The townspeople were in shock. Some wept openly, others prayed. The symbolic center of their community had vanished overnight in smoke and ash. But the timing was suspicious. Too suspicious. The fire, said to be caused by a chimney spark, had destroyed everything except the cellar. When cleanup crews began clearing the ruins in the spring of 1668, they found a hidden chamber that had survived the blaze. Inside were hundreds of vials, journals dating back to 1647, and most damning of all, a final entry in Cornelius's handwriting. The girl's journal has been found. Wilson has betrayed us. Hartford will send men. All must be cleansed by fire. Providence has protected us before it will do so again. The implication was clear. The Petons had faked their deaths. Authorities across New England were alerted. Descriptions of the brothers were circulated from Boston to Jamestown, but no confirmed sightings ever emerged. They had disappeared as quietly and effectively as they had once arrived. The trail goes. Cold new names, new crimes, Though the Peton brothers were officially declared dead in the fire of 1667, many officials and even a few townsfolk remained unconvinced. The fire's timing was too convenient, the bodies too badly burned for identification. And most importantly, the final journal entry recovered from the ruins indicated intentional destruction, not accidental tragedy. What followed was a colony-wide manhunt, a quiet but urgent search, stretching from New England to the southern colonies, and even back to England itself. Over the next several years, sightings began to surface, most of them unconfirmed. But one stood out in 1670. 3 men arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, each with different surnames. Preston, but eerily similar skills and appearances to the Peton brothers. One opened an apothecary, the second a small chapel, and the third offered legal services to new settlers. They were discreet, educated, and devout. And almost immediately the same pattern emerged. Wealthy colonists on their deathbeds began experiencing divine visions, followed by sudden will revisions in favor of the kind brothers who helped them see the truth. By 1673, just as colonial authorities in Virginia began to take notice, the 3 Prestons vanished overnight, leaving behind only a hidden chamber beneath the apothecary filled with glass vials, forged documents, and coded journals. The equipment mirrored what had been found beneath the ruins in Newfield. But once again, no bodies, no arrests, no resolution. Then, in 1675, across the Atlantic, another anomaly surfaced. Parish records from Bristol, England, noted the sudden arrival of 3 middle-aged brothers, this time under the surname Penworth. They claimed to have returned from the colonies after years of missionary and medical work. Within months, they had secured positions as a physician, a cleric, and a solicitor, respectively. Their reputations grew swiftly, particularly for their work among the dying. Notably, they focused on those with no direct heirs, but significant wealth. But in 1683, a fire consumed their home in Bristol, another accidental blaze that left no remains. Once again, the pattern repeated, a trio of educated men offering comfort and salvation to the dying, followed by death, fortune, and sudden disappearance. Were these truly the Peton brothers, there was never definitive proof. But the repetition of Skill's behaviors and escapes created a chilling possibility that the fraud didn't end in Newfield, it simply evolved. A legal reckoning. The Witness Statute of 1670. The Peton affair, though buried from public consciousness, had profound legal repercussions in Connecticut. In 1670, just 3 years after the fire, the colonial legislature passed a sweeping reform known as the Witness Statute. At its core, the law prohibited any person who stood to benefit from a will from serving as a witness to that will's signing. It also required that 2 unrelated parties be present for all deathbed declarations involving property transfer. This statute was revolutionary for its time. It signaled a growing awareness that spiritual authority could be abused, especially when entwined with legal and medical power. Though the law did not name the Peton brothers directly, the legislative records refer to recent misuses of divine testimony for material gain, a clear nod to the Newfield case. Behind closed doors, Constance Peton's journal had served as the foundation for these protections. Legal scholars today recognize the Witness Statute as one of the earliest documented efforts to separate spiritual manipulation from legal legitimacy in American history. It marked a turning point, however quiet, in the evolution of trust, consent, and inheritance law. And though the statute may have come too late to save the Peton's victims, It laid the groundwork for centuries of future safeguards. Beyond its practical effect, the law also signaled a shift in collective awareness. The colony, even in its religious conservatism, had been forced to confront the fact that piety could be weaponized. The Petons had shown what could happen when unchecked spiritual influence, medical access, and legal authority converged in a single household. That terrifying intersection would haunt generations of legal theorists and continue to shape law well into the American Republic. The legacy of Constance Peton. Among the many tragedies left in the wake of the Peton scandal, none is more poignant than the fate of Constance. History nearly lost her story. Had her journal not survived, she would have been remembered, if at all, as a fragile girl overcome by illness and sorrow. But instead, her careful documentation, her courage, and her willingness to face 3 powerful men alone turned the tide of justice. She became posthumously a symbol of truth in the face of overwhelming deceit. In later years, as her journal was studied by scholars and officials, her role came into clearer focus. She had documented the dosages, the spiritual manipulation, the legal traps, and even the psychological games her uncles played. She recognized not only the method of their scheme, but the emotional choreography required to make it believable. Most chillingly, she saw that her own inheritance, wealth from her maternal grandmother in England, was their next target. The Petons had planned to slowly administer increasing doses of their elixir, inducing her to sign over her fortune under the guise of spiritual insight, and then bring about her death by melancholy. But she discovered the plan. She tried to escape, and though she was killed before she could testify, her written words outlived their voices. Her journal became the crack through which sunlight pierced the carefully constructed darkness of the Petons' empire. Today, Constance is remembered not in church records or legal textbooks, but in whispers by historians, legal scholars, and a handful of descendants from Newfield who still visit the overgrown foundation where the Peton home once stood. To them, she is a ghost of conscience, the girl who noticed too much, asked the right questions, and wrote down what she saw when no one else dared to look. Piety, power, and the monsters. We trust what makes the Peton case so terrifying is not the method, but the plausibility. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no curses. Just 3 educated men exploiting the deepest fears and highest hopes of a faithful community. They used the symbols of salvation, scripture, prayer, medicine, not as tools of healing, but as instruments of control. And because they wrapped their crimes in the language of piety, they were never questioned until it was far too late. This case forces us to ask hard questions. Who do we trust when we are at our weakest? What safeguards exist when authority speaks with a sacred voice? And how many modern versions of this scheme still play out today, less obvious, less documented, but no less real? The Petons remind us that true evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it kneels beside our deathbeds, prays over our suffering, and offers us comfort while it rewrites our legacy. It quotes scripture as it poisons and speaks of heaven while it robs us blind. The terrifying truth is that the worst monsters are those who appear righteous, those who speak the language of our deepest beliefs and weaponize our trust. The legacy of the Peton brothers isn't only the laws they inspired or the journals they left behind. It's the question they force us to confront across centuries. In whom do we place our faith, and what do we require before we question that faith? The Return of the Historian, Dr. Hawthorne's Rediscovery. More than 3 centuries after the last known trace of the Peton brothers vanished in smoke and whispers, their story might have remained a footnote in legal records, forgotten, misfiled, or ignored. But in 1998, a Yale historian named Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, researching early American palliative care, stumbled across a strange reference in the personal papers of Jonathan Edwards, the famous theologian of the First Great Awakening. The note mentioned the false shepherds of Newfield and referred cryptically to a girl who had seen too much and died for it. Intrigued, Dr. Hawthorne began a deep archival search. Her path led her through Connecticut's Colonial Court, records, private correspondences, and a long-lost archive at the Connecticut Historical Society, where she discovered a misfiled box containing court transcripts, early legislative drafts, and most importantly, Constance Peton's journal. The journal had been preserved as evidence but never made public. What Dr. Hawthorne found astonished her, a fully documented case of medical, religious, and legal abuse, centuries before such categories were even defined in law. Constance had recorded symptoms, ingredients, spiritual conversations, and legal changes, all with a clarity that modern historians rarely encounter in first-person colonial narratives. The journal wasn't just a personal record, it was a forensic log. And it revealed something chilling. The Peton brothers had been practicing a form of psychological and chemical manipulation years ahead of their time. Dr. Hawthorne and her research team compiled these findings into an extensive academic report. Her conclusion was clear. The Peton case was not only one of the earliest examples of inheritance fraud, but also an unprecedented interdisciplinary crime, blending medicine, theology, and law in a way that made detection nearly impossible. The story of the Peton brothers wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a prototype of abuse that echoed into the present. An unholy trinity of influence. The Peton brothers' true genius and horror lay in their understanding of human psychology and belief. They didn't just manipulate individuals, they manipulated entire systems. In a society where religion explained everything, where death was near and often, and where few questioned those who claimed to speak for God, they operated with the perfect camouflage. Their model was simple. Obadiah controlled the body, using his chemical elixirs to bring the dying into suggestible states. Jeremiah controlled the spirit, framing hallucinations as divine visions and interpreting them for the family and community. Cornelius controlled the law, turning spiritual utterances into legal declarations. Each domain supported the other. When someone questioned a strange will, Jeremiah would defend it as God's will. If someone suspected poisoning, Cornelius would cite formal documentation. When families asked why only the Petons received bequests, Obadiah offered vague medical explanations, shielding their motives with his professional mystique. It was the perfect triad of control, each brother reinforcing the other. And the brilliance of it all was that their piety disarmed suspicion. To accuse them would be to accuse not just 3 men, but the structures of society itself, the church, the clinic, and the court. In doing so, they exposed how authority, when left unchallenged, becomes indistinguishable from divinity. Their downfall did not come from whistleblowers within those institutions, but from a girl with no title, no power, and no one to protect her. And yet her act of truth-telling continues to expose the danger of leaving too much power in too few hands. The Peton story endures as a cautionary tale, not because of its violence, but because of its eerie sophistication and its uncomfortable familiarity. in modern contexts. Echoes through time. Lessons from a forgotten scandal. Centuries after the Petons vanished into legend, their methods remain disturbingly relevant. While their exact combination of opium belladonna and psychoactive herbs may seem archaic today, the broader principles of their manipulation, targeting vulnerability, leveraging belief and dressing control in the guise of care, are strategies still used in more subtle forms. Modern scammers, cult leaders, and even certain professionals follow a disturbingly similar playbook: isolate the target, introduce emotional dependency, and reframe authority as protection. The Petons were ahead of their time not just in chemistry, but in understanding the human need for comfort and meaning, especially in the face of mortality. They knew that grief and fear suppress skepticism, and that if you offer people hope, no matter how tainted, they will often accept it without question. Their story also reminds us that good intentions are no defense against structural corruption. The people of Newfield were not foolish. They were compassionate, faithful, and desperate to believe in something greater than themselves. That desire made them perfect victims, and perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. The Peton brothers didn't con a town through force, but through trust. Today, their case is studied in legal history classes, medical ethics seminars, and religious studies programs. But beyond academia, it lingers in folk memory. In Newfield now, a small Connecticut town with barely a plaque marking the site, locals still report strange dreams near the old foundation stones. Some claim to feel watched, others say they hear faint whispering at night. Rational minds may dismiss these as imagination. But for those who've read Constance's words, such whispers are not easily ignored. The shadows of the past have long memories. Conclusion: the monsters who look like men. The true horror of the Peton story is not that it happened once, but that it could happen again. Their crimes were not built on sorcery or brute force, but on the calculated use of respectability. They dressed well, they spoke gently, they prayed often. And behind that facade, they erased the autonomy of the dying, rewrote legacies, and ensured their own power through suffering masked as salvation. We often imagine evil as chaotic, loud, or overt. But the Petons were quiet, strategic. They operated under the cover of reverence. They weren't monsters in the woods, they were respected men in the front row of the church. That is what makes their legacy so chilling. It reveals how proximity to sacred spaces does not equal purity, and how the language of compassion can be used to mask cruelty. Their story, resurrected by a historian and preserved by a brave girl's hand, forces us to reevaluate how we recognize integrity. It reminds us that blind faith can be as dangerous as malice, and that institutions are only as moral as the people who control them. The Petons were not anomalies. They were reflections of a society that gave power to freely question too little and sanctified anyone who spoke in the name of God. So the next time someone speaks with certainty about your soul, your body, or your final wishes, ask who benefits from your trust. Ask who writes your story when you're no longer able to, because the Petons may be long dead, but their playbook lives on.